Gianni Botsford with a lecture called Local Adaptation. And as a discussant chairing this session, we have David Connor, which is a member of the Atelier, of the Making Atelier. So I'm handing over to David, and David, all yours.
I think you did freeze for a bit now, but let me welcome Gianni Botsford from Gianni Botsford Architects. And I would describe Gianni as one of the leading architects of his generation. And we've particularly invited him because of his experience in making. His one-to-one experience is mainly in Studio in the Woods, which he probably been working on for the last 10 years off and on. It's founded originally by Piers Taylor, and I think Gianni and Kate and Mole were some of the very first members to start that enterprise, where for about 4 days over a bank holiday, people gathered to build projects led by various team leaders, which they build one-off experiments, mainly out of timber. People from all walks of life, a lot of architects, a lot of designers, a lot of artists, writers, carpenters very often arrive, and they build things at one-to-one. And that, I think, leads into Gianni's work, and Gianni's work leads into that exercise. Just give you a little bit of Gianni's background in education, because I think it's slightly unusual. He studied originally a year of English literature at Cardiff before taking a foundation course in art in America, and then doing an interior design course for 3 years at Kingston before leaving for practice. And then he went for 2 years at the AA under John Fraser, who was really the beginning of computerized design computerized design, the very early days, just before the internet was getting going properly. His private practice has won many awards, but particularly the Lubetkin Prize for Casa Quique in Costa Rica. So Gianni's worked from very small scale, experimental scale in Studio in the Woods, and now is building quite large projects in China. So Gianni, I'm going to lead over to you now, so you can take it away.
Thanks, Dave. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah,
Perfect.
Yeah, good. So thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. I thought what I'd do is try and talk about the background of the work and the thinking, and at the same time talk about the process of design that we go through. So we describe it as local adaptation, which in nature is how differences evolve over time. And in our work, it's really about being close to, sorry, I'm just trying to set something up on my screen properly. There, okay. It's about working with the climate, the context, and the culture of each environment we work in. And there's this kind of similarity, obviously, with how nature works, and I think how we're trying to work, partly because we're trying very much to work with nature in what we do. So sunlight is a very important part of the investigations we go under, and that's shown, in many ways in vernacular architecture. This is an example in Marrakesh in Morocco, an aerial photograph looking down on the city. You can see very narrow streets and courtyards, very kind of small openings. So it's evolved very much to work with its very extreme environment, but in a kind of natural way. And then when you think about cultural issues, very simply, in this country, for instance, we'll all sit in the sun in a deck chair. And in the picture on the right, it's set in Washington, and everybody's sitting in the shade. And that leads to kind of different relationship with the sun and your environment, depending on where you are on the planet. And because our work has ended up being quite international, that's been quite important for us. So as David said, I went to the AA having kind of worked for about 6 years, about 5 of which in David's practice, but kind of felt a need to discover myself, I suppose, in a different way. I went to the AA and chose the unit that I was least comfortable to be in, that I knew least about, which was John Fraser's evolutionary architecture unit. And he was a kind of pioneer of the use of computers, and I had very little or no experience of the use of computers then. And in my interview with him, he kind of asked, did I have any experience of computers? And I said no. And I got into the unit for that reason. So I think the people who came to him with experience and people without, he was more interested in. But the title of the project, When I Stand Still, I'm Moving, was through the 2 years I was with him, I was looking at sunlight, and I realized that it's us moving, it's the earth moving, it's not the sun moving. And I think in architecture, people always talk about the sun moving overhead, but in fact, we're moving at 1,000 miles an hour as the earth rotates, and a further 67,000 miles an hour as we go around the sun. And I think once you understand that we are moving rather than sun moving, I think it changes your perception of how you need to respond to it architecturally. So I came to the unit just as this book came out, An Evolutionary Architecture, and John was working with his students on using computers in architecture in a way that hadn't been done before, generating form and organization using computers, and using the intelligence and the kind of power they had to investigate issues that couldn't normally be investigated. So what's on the screen now is actually my 5th year diploma project, which was a computer code written in Lisp. And this is something obviously I had no experience of and no knowledge of and had to learn how to do. And what's really interesting about writing code is you have to understand every issue that you're dealing with, every comma, every element within this is just incredibly important in terms of making it work. So it's an extremely hard thing to do at the time, and it's now much more straightforward, but it's 25 years later, it's still only emerging as kind of a useful tool with Grasshopper and so on, or kind of almost everyday tool. So the program initially looked at sunlight, but in a very simple way, trying to understand what the differences were on different places on the planet, plotting a point in space from different locations on Earth. And as it got more complex and added more rules to it, cultural rules, density rules, and so on, the results became more outstanding, more complex. So this is generating form based on solar criteria, plus some of these other issues that came in that affect solar criteria. So in a way, I'd spent 2 years at architecture school looking at only one thing. And more importantly for me, not designing a building. And I think that's fundamental to the way I kind of see things now in a more open way, that architecture isn't just building, it's a kind of approach to your environment. So I was quite lucky to leave the AA and be able to set up my own practice straight away on a commission of a house, a large house on a backland site in Notting Hill. There was a warehouse hidden away behind lots of other houses. You couldn't see it from the street. Down an alleyway And the plot was roughly 40 meters by 15, with high walls around it, 10 meters high on some side and 8 meters on others. And we partnered with Arab engineers working with their software, which was Radiance, to understand straight away what was happening on the site environmentally and with sunlight. And this was the first map they gave us, which was the annual hours of sun at the ground plane. But when we started to split up that information, so if you look at the winter map, there are very, very few hours of sun that hit the ground. So my client had bought a very expensive site in the middle of London that the sun never hits in the winter. So obviously a kind of aim we had was to see a way if I was overcoming that. So these are looking at different seasons. And then we started breaking up that information more and more to interrogate it more carefully, including physical models of that data that was always in the computer. We needed to kind of find a way to visualize it and look out of it. But one of the most powerful things we did was to switch on and off attributes that we found important. So we were looking for a place for the garden, and this was the highest levels of sunlight year round on the plot. So you can see it's kind of 3 or 4 meters up in the air and 2/3 of the way down the site. This was the opposite of that, the lowest levels of sunlight throughout the year. And then this one that actually led probably the most influence on the final form was the only places that sunlight hit all year round. And you can see they're kind of very high up on the boundary wall, 10 meters up in the air. And they're the only places that get sunlight summer, winter, and spring. So the house was designed upside down with all the bedrooms on the ground floor and all the living rooms at double height spaces on the first floor, with a glazed roof, 320 square meter glazed roof, with a series of courtyards punctured through the glazed roof that served all the rooms. So this fifth facade became really your view of the sky and the way that light came into the house, as well as through the courtyards. David asked me to include kind of pictures of making. So I've added pictures of how this was built. It's a very tight backland site we couldn't get cranes from the street. We had to have smaller mobile cranes. It's all built in concrete, as we couldn't bear on any of the party walls. So you can see the first party wall growing up, which is a vertical cantilever 10 meters high. And we're building very tight up against 14 different neighboring buildings and with different conditions that we had to kind of deal with. So as the kind of project slowly emerged, these are the beams for the roof that span across the full width of the house without any intermediate support. And you can see then these deep beams becoming the kind of frame for each room below and for the glazing above. The concrete was exposed internally and externally was clad, which is why you get 2 different thicknesses you can see here in this image. So here is the whole structure that's been built behind these 14 different conditions and neighboring houses. And the glass roof going on and the interior views. So there's a mixture of kind of very limited palette of exposed concrete and aluminium, stainless steel mesh glazing. So the roof itself had another process of kind of optimizing the facade, which was 4 different frit patterns, 10%, 40%, 80%, and I think 60%, which were distributed according to the uses in the room below. And there was a very early use of optimization with Arab doing that as a kind of facade tool. And then the facade itself was a perforated stainless steel facade with these sliding panels. And from the inside, you can see through these. And from the outside, they have this kind of sense of opaqueness. So the left-hand image, if you remember the one of the image of the highest levels of sunlight all year round, led to the house being built as high as possible on the 10-meter high side. And that's where sunlight comes through in the winter, hits that wall, and then lights the rest of the house. Excuse me. So you can see that light is a kind of major part of how the house works, and it's controlled through the roof, through blinds, through the concrete itself that tempers the light. And you look into courtyard, so it's a very private house hidden away. This is the main courtyard that the living room looks west and the kitchen looks east into. And on the lower floor, the bathrooms and the master bathroom and the swimming pool connect. And this is the final house in its context, which is only visible from the air. This is a short film we made just trying to kind of look at the experience of the house and how it's lived in and the kind of layers of occupation and layers of activity within the house. So you can see there the first floor, living space looking out onto the courtyard. The private elements all kind of hidden at the lower levels of light on the ground floor and have a very different character to them. And the light is moving constantly and changing and controlled by blinds, controlled by opening and closing of windows. And the character then changes significantly throughout the house as you adjust these. So this limited palette of materials, the stainless steel, the aluminium, the glass, concrete, just create a pared down character for the house and allow the light to be the main protagonist. This project is a very different project in a very different context, and I think it illustrates, how we work in that we start from the same starting point, but see what emerges through the process of investigation. There's a house on the coast in Costa Rica on the Caribbean side, facing a black sand beach, a volcanic beach. It's very, very wet in Costa Rica. It rains huge amount. Very lush, very humid. Our site was full of coconut trees, coconut palms and other trees, laurel and so on. When I visited there, trying to understand the context and the cultural context and how people live there, we visited a friend in this house who sat in this chair on the left and smoked his cigarette and blew it out of the window. And at the end of the day, he closed these windows, and I think what struck me is the windows had no glass in them and no mesh. They were just a kind of more psychological barrier between inside and outside. But actually, the connection with nature and the connection with outside is very constant, and you don't close the house off. You keep air moving all the time through the house. And at the same time, the way house buildings are built there in very kind of simple and straightforward way, using local materials. So this is corrugated iron and an 8-way junction of bits of leftover 4x2 or 8x4. So in analyzing the site, the problem is a very different one. You're looking at how to keep sun out rather than how to keep sun in. So it's the opposite problem to Lighthouse. And this was our first investigation of the site itself, hoping that the tree canopy would provide a lot of shade, but it wasn't enough. So the initial investigations we were doing were looking at self-shaded forms. So this is a square meter on the ground, and what form is required to be generated to control that. And these are other forms that are generated with a different plan to see what would be needed, which led to the eventual form, which was essentially a three-sided space that was open to the view to the sea and open to the view to the jungle to the back, that fully protected itself from the sun and fully protected the facades from the sun. So there's an existing house on our plot and two neighboring houses and a small lane between us and the beach that we were facing, and a sun path overhead. And we located a site between the trees of roughly 100 square meters. Sorry. Sorry, it's just frozen at the moment. Okay. And what we looked at was rotating that to the meridian to have a much better control of the sun path on the site. And at the same time, it created privacy to the neighbors on the right, privacy to the neighbors on the left, and views through to the sea and to the jungle at the back. And in section, the two buildings we produced were pulled apart to be out of each other's wind shadow. So the smaller building is a bedroom looking to the jungle. The larger building is a studio writing space facing the jungle, lifted up off the ground to promote breeze and promote airflow through the house. And then the facades themselves were very open glazed facades with louvers, all built with very local materials. So this is a kachar, very heavy material that was used for the foundations, and laurel that was used for the superstructure. We'd sent lots of drawings over, but we realized that they weren't understanding the drawings, and by bringing a model, the whole project kind of came to life. So I went over with this model and explained it to the contractors and essentially said we'd like this built to a much bigger scale over there, and showed them where it was on the plot. And the model became a tool that was invaluable to explain the project to the people building it themselves. So that was a kind of cultural translation we made, which was really fundamental. But not only did we do that model, we did models of every single junction within the model. So they had a catalogue of all the different types of junctions they had to make. And it was very interesting how by doing that, they understood everything. And then it emerged very quickly after that. So the first part of the project was to build the piles with kachar, which are buried into the ground, very simply, a very small, shallow foundation. And these ironwood piles held in place. And 3 months later, the superstructure was up. And I think what's really interesting about this photograph is you can see there's kind of no damage to the nature around it. There's no protection, there's no equipment, there's no plant, there's no scaffolding. It's as if kind of they're just really delicately building around it, but actually it's kind of how they do what they do. So the superstructure went up and it was clad externally in the timber as well. And you can now see that view to the sea. And the final house nestles in amongst existing trees with the kind of 4.5 meter high facade facing the sea. And here you see the form more clearly that's generated very specifically to keep the sun off the main facades. There's the link, the walkway between the living room and the bedroom. The brief was for a house for a writer, my father, 16,000 books and a grand piano and a close connection to nature, really is all he wanted. And interestingly, the books themselves generated the form in a sense as well as all the other things we looked at, partly because we had to get that many books in, but also became a kind of structural solution that the bookshelves themselves were part of the structure. So my father could sit there with the books on either side of him, facing the sea through the louvered facade, which is always facing the sea and the breeze from the jungle. And this can be fully opened both by sliding the panels, but also by rotating the louvers themselves. Shaded external places were created to sit out. And then the bedroom has a kind of very different character, much more private character facing the jungle. And it was all clad in local corrugated iron. So those earlier images I showed of how you make things there, we use that for how we made it here. As David said, I've been working with Kate Darby on Studio in the Woods since the beginning, that set up by Piers Taylor. And every year we look at some aspect of sunlight and how to make something visible in a period of time, very short period of time, usually 3 to 4 days. And this year on the Isle of Wight, we kind of try and start with very little other than that we know we want to investigate this issue somehow. And we came with a kind of pre-knowledge that there were these chalk escarpments in the landscape that we wanted to make more visible. And we also brought mirrors with us. And we started by reflecting the sun onto these chalk escarpments and realized very quickly, just holding them, that we needed a device to control how the sun reflects off the chalk itself. So we started to build structures that would hold the mirror in a very specific position so that we could play around with which position we wanted that to be. And 2 things were really interesting about what happened very early on. One was we reflected the sun as in a circle. We were expecting to reflect a square, but we reflected a circle on the chalk, but it moved incredibly quickly. And that came back to what I was saying earlier on about how fast we are moving. And we realized that it was only, 2 minutes that you would see the sun reflected from a fixed position of a mirror, which we thought was really interesting. Started to measure that specifically and trying to think, well, could we build maybe 3 structures that at different times of the day would reflect only for those 3 minutes on the escarpment and never on anything else. So only on the escarpments and not on anything that's around it. And I think what's interesting about the way we work in Studio in the Woods is we don't design anything. It's very much just investigation, hands-on measuring and hands-on observation. And you build up these structures and you slowly build a knowledge of what it is you're measuring and what it is you're trying to show. So these structures you're seeing emerge through that process have not been designed in any way other than that we want to achieve a specific aim, which is for the light to reflect on the chalk escarpment you can see in the background there. And as these structures emerge, what we found also really interesting was through observation, they became very different to each other. So at 3 different times a day, they became surprisingly different in form. So there's an image of Ted Cullinan walking through the landscape to the 3 structures. And I can't remember the times, I think there were 10, 12 and 2 possibly. Each one of them is orientated to a very specific moment. The sun reflects on that day onto this chalk escarpment, and that form would change the next day if one were to do it again, or the next week. And they're very, very unique to that place. So here you see the mirrors themselves, and you see how two of them in shade, one of them is being hit by the sun, and that would be reflecting on that spot at that moment in time. So that kind of working with those tools, those hand-on tools and the analytical tools, we kind of go back and forth in practice with those devices and ways of working. I think in teaching, we try and really push the analysis, with the hands-on analysis before using the computational tools that are available to us all now. This is another project where sunlight became really important. It's a backland site, again, Notting Hill, but facing north, a north-facing garden, very, very heavily overshadowed by surrounding buildings, and very, very little solar access, and a very large tree and a bungalow that we aim to demolish. So through initial modeling, we realized how little sun hit it, and we had to kind of break that information down again. So this was using Ecotect to look at how, as you go up through the site, I think a meter at a time, the amount of sun on a kind of annual measurement changes. And you see things emerging. There's kind of two areas there that have a higher amount of sunlight than anywhere else. And you see areas that are very much less good at solar access, so nearer the buildings themselves. And there's a kind of diagram there of where we ended up, which is essentially two out the building built in the shadow, and the two garden spaces that the house looks out onto. And from that, we, through a kind of long process, this is a short version of how this roof form evolved through that, but connecting those dots of the very specific location of the skylight to bring light in, similarly way to lighthouse, whenever it does hit the site, even in winter, and two gardens at the optimal location for the gardens at ground level. And that form is generated that then became the kind of the main part of how this house works. So we developed how the structure worked. We had to transform the initial model through Grasshopper into a computational version of it, so that we could then develop the, we could 3D print it, we could develop the structure, we could work out all the aspects of it once we had it in the computer itself. And I want to talk a bit about making here as well. So we started this project with a company called Cowley Timber and spent probably 2 years developing the roof structure with them. And they came up with a very counterintuitive solution, which was to use plywood layered up in opposing directions to form all these very twisted curvature that the roof form itself created. These are images of samples they did and trials they did. And then they mocked up the overall form in their workshops, and then produced a series of detailed drawings of every aspect of the roof, using this very unusual system of plywood and plugs and screws to hold it all together. Now, after 2 years, they unfortunately went bankrupt, and we had to start all over again that process. And I think what's interesting in terms of making is if you make something or design something that's very, very particular, and there's only one solution how you can make it, you can get very easily stuck, as we did with Cowley. So we then had to find another partner to build this roof and found a company in Germany called Zublin Timber, who had a different idea about how to make it, which we accepted, which was essentially glulam beams. But every glulam beam in that structure is entirely different and is curving in 3 different directions. So it curves on plan, it curves on section, it curves on elevation. So these drawings show every single different beam and how they change throughout the building, and the complexities of those changes. And all of these drawings are actually generated by our 3D model that they took and then developed their own essentially 2D drawings to build these beams, which is again is really interesting. We all think that the 3D model will produce everything, but in fact it still doesn't. And it would have been wasteful maybe to make it from a kind of 3D process of milling, which was something we talked about. Then we went to another workshop. This is in northern Italy, where the roof was completely fabricated in their workshop, using, again, traditional techniques, but overlaid with digital techniques. So you'll just see on the floor here a one-to-one printout of the 3D model, which how they lofted then the beams themselves. So here you can see they've taken a beam, created a glulam beam, sliced it up, and then they're re-bending it on a former and re-gluing it to get the second 2 twists of the roof. They then dismantled it, brought it back to London, and delivered it and craned it in 14 sections to this quite tricky site. And then this is one of the sections being lowered. So you can see each section has the cross member, and then they've left out the cross member between, I think, every second or third, every third beam. So they position one of the sections and then they'll come back and fill in the cross members. And the whole structure is then screwed together from the back where you can't see it, and then lined in a timber lining, and then a secondary structure for the roof itself and then for the insulation. And there's a moment soon where it just slots into place. That then was lined using almost boat building techniques with softwood in 2 different directions. And then we had to look at how the roof itself was made and clad. And we helped the copper company by producing one-to-one pattern pieces using our grasshopper script for them to lay out and cut their copper. So you can see on the top left-hand image, we printed them in the studio, cut them at 1-to-1, rolled them up, took them to the site, and then positioned them on site. And they worked directly from our printouts for that roof. And here's the copper being cut and positioned. The site was, again, a backland site hidden behind these houses. This is a plan with the 2 gardens I talked about, and the light wells going down to the lower floors and the living space. And in section, you see how there's 2 stories of basement below ground, which are also served through light wells. And you see how it's kind of overlooked and overshadowed by the neighboring houses, and how little access to sky it has. So this roof and this form and everything about this house has been generated through the processes I'm talking about, which are all based on the context. So it's not, in my mind, it's highly contextual. In other people's mind, it looks completely alien potentially, because it's not like all the other buildings. So I think that kind of reading of context is really important to us, is what is the context you're working with? And for us, it's not about mimicking what's around it. It's about using the constraints you're given and understanding the sunlight, the views, privacy, all the issues we have to deal with on these projects, which generate then these forms that we're dealing with. Again, a limited palette of materials, but a very different palette of materials. The timber, the copper roof, the copper internally in the kitchen. And this is one of those rare moments where you get a moment to yourself to experience the house and look up through the skylight you spent 10 years designing where it should be. And it's very rare. And then very quickly it's taken over by the client and you can't do that anymore. Here you can see the sun streaming in from the west in the afternoon through the skylight and through the courtyard itself and the kitchen. And then the house descends down through 2 levels to the lowest floor, which is about 9 meters underground with a swimming pool. There's also daylit from 2 skylights, which are positioned through the similar process. And this is a little film we made doing time-lapse movies of the light moving through the house through different spaces, which are mostly over a day. But I think even when you look at that skylight, you see how the sun is hitting the skylight and not other parts of the garden. And here we are 8-9 meters underground and the light's moving. So everywhere in this house, there's a kind of experience of light and its movement and changes that are constant and change from day to day. And obviously working, the light working with these forms creates a lot of those differences. David asked me quickly just to show what we're working on at the moment. So we spent actually the last few years quite a lot of time in the Far East, mostly Taiwan, but through working in Taiwan, we built a relationship with a local architect there who invited us for a competition for a tower for a mobile phone company called Oppo. And we won the competition. And of all the buildings we designed in the Far East, this is the only one that's being built. So this is now on site, and I visited it well before lockdown. I was there when it was just the basement structure, but I've been having photographs sent since then of the construction going up, and it topped out a few months ago, and I'm not quite sure how much longer there is to go, but you can see the facade going up now. We're building an interesting small house in Hampstead, which is based around an extension built by Norman Foster in 1968. So this image is of one of the earliest Foster works. He lived around the corner at the time. Patty Hopkins was project architect on this. And what we're doing is retaining his extension, but replacing the cottage that it extended. So we're essentially extending an extension with a new house on 4 stories with a basement, ground, and 2 upper floors. And this is an image of the Foster extension as it is now with works underway. And these are the upper levels of that structure. Looking out onto the roof of the Foster extension, there will be a roof terrace. And these angle walls really working with the neighboring context with different angles depending on the relationship with neighbors. And a house is in planning in Sardinia in Italy, which overlooks the west and the sunset and the sea all in one direction. And from this direction, there is a small road that the client wanted extreme privacy from. So from this side, you cannot see into the house, and it's a series of basically planes of walls and roof that move through the topography to generate views through to the sunset. This is then from the view from the sunset looking back, so it's very open that way. A series of very covered outside terraces and connected spaces that you get to only by walking outside. So there are no internal corridors in this house. You basically move through the landscape. So I'd like to end there and just say that each project I've shown you is attempting to look at this idea of local adaptation and adapt and become very specific to its context. I think each project wouldn't work anywhere other than where it is, and is only designed to be there, and it should only be there. And I think through that process gives the projects their uniqueness. And thank you very much. Shall I stop sharing, Dave?
Yes, please.
Okay. Sorry, I had a really sore throat then.
Thanks, Gianni. It was really wonderful to see. I mean, I've known all that work all my life, I mean, for a long time. And actually, I didn't know a lot of that. I didn't know a lot about how it came about. I know the work, but particularly Garden House, I was really amazed at the technology and the use of complex curves and the difficulty of making that work, how difficult it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, but what I love about the work and why I asked you to come is in a way because of the different scales, and particularly I really, really like the Studio in the Woods work. I know it sounds kind of ludicrous because I know that's 4 days a week, but it's that link then into the larger scale projects and the way that the thoroughness and that link between the hand and the making of those objects, those one-to-one objects in the woods, kind of go through the whole of your work. I know that you were doing work before that Studio in the Woods stuff. I'm not saying it's the generator, but I particularly thought it's important for students to see what you do with your hands and how it can end up in a kind of abstract set of drawings. And that's why I particularly thought it was useful to our unit to see that.
Yeah, I mean, that whole Studio in the Woods process, we really didn't know how we were going to approach that. And we just thought, well, let's do what we, are interested in and see what comes from it. And I think we were always very surprised by every year what emerged through just setting a very defined set of criteria and things to be looking at and seeing what happens. So it's this kind of not designing that I find really interesting and letting, through observation, something emerge. And, it's highly pressurized. We have 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days, we're going to have people looking at what we're doing. And it focuses minds, and we say, well, we know what we're looking at. What are we finding interesting? What do we have to do to make that visible? How do we record it? How do we make it? In a way, the kind of making is a sideline. It's making what we do visible. It's not a kind of crafted object. It's just physically what it needs to be to describe what we were looking at.
But it ends up having a great beauty in itself. That.
Well, it's always organic. Whatever you do, if you do with sunlight in that way, it's always going to be organic.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. Again, just realizing that.
I just would like to ask you one question about Garden House in that context. When you showed the photo, it obviously works really well internally. But do you ever make a concession, to the cultural context in that case? It kind of looks, it does, and you showed that photograph of the copper roof in the context of the backlands of Notting Hill, in fact.
Yeah.
It does look quite alien. Does that ever worry you? I mean, I actually like it. I don't have
Yeah.
a problem with it in any sense, but
It's,
in
I mean,
many ways, I think that architecture is a very many layered thing, has to answer many, many questions, not just one question. And I'm sure that you do that. You know, I'm absolutely certain you answer all these questions.
but there's no way we're trying to be provocative with doing that. For us,
No,
it was the solution. And I think as a diagram, you have to think of it as a pavilion in a landscape. So in a garden, it's a very unusual setting in that it is literally filling up most of a garden, just because of what happened in the 60s and the house was built there that would never happen otherwise. And so I think if you try and see it like that, pavilions did tend to be different forms, even in, you know, in Kensington and Chelsea.
Yeah.
It's not quite a park and it's not really a garden, but that is the idea. And that's the kind of argument we made, which interestingly, the planners were quite happy with.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, these things look alien to begin with, and I think they will slowly become less alien and people get used to it.
Since you called it a pavilion in a landscape, I'm totally sold on it. You've changed my mind entirely about it. I see it in an entirely different way now. Callan, do you want to chip in a bit?
I will start asking some questions. So, Gianni, thank you very, very much for the presentation. In the background, I started curating the question and bringing all in. And I wanted to start with a very specific one, but then I realized that all what you're talking about right now with David kind of links to my last question, which is related to what Simon Sturgis said in 2 weeks ago. He said that we should build easy to readapt buildings rather than bespoke ones because of the climate crisis. So I was wondering, what's your view on this? How does your practice fit into this new paradigm? And do you oppose it? Because your buildings are not really easy to readapt. They are very bespoke, related to the site.
I mean, the sites we are using, I would say, have a limited use, and they are very, I don't know, unusual, specific, hard to develop, not attractive to people, certainly not to developers. And that's, you know, in a way why they have become sites that we can build houses on because nobody else wants to. So, you know, I think they're not sites for housing necessarily. I mean, of course, we're not against that idea, but I think if they can last and be there for the next 100 years or however many years, they've served their purpose and they don't need to be adapted. I mean, interestingly, you know, you design a house and new owners come into the house. So the lighthouse is on its third owner, and every owner, who are pretty demanding owners, have done nothing to the house. They've all said, there's nothing I need to do to it. It's exactly how I want it to be. So I think that's a really big testament to the house itself, in that it works for different people. I find it really interesting because it was highly tailored for a family. And in fact, now the new owner lives there on his own, but works a lot from home, and he has lots of space to work in, and he just, you know, it just works for him. So, you know, that adaptation is there.
Yeah.
Same with Garden House, it's on the second owner already. And all they're doing is tweaking, you know, small things. So I don't know, you can't make everything for everybody. I think tailoring is a good thing. And I suppose a lot of our work is very, very tailored in that way. But I find that interesting as well.
It is. I find that interesting as well. I just wanted to bring this idea forward because we had this talk 2 weeks ago. So I'm just curious on your opinion on it. Next, with a very specific question about the lighthouse. So you finished in 2005, and I was wondering, did you consider the building's carbon footprint before starting the project? And if you were to do it again today, with the whole uproar of the climate crisis, would you make it differently or no?
No, I mean, that's obviously a challenge we're facing on our projects now. And I think it wasn't something that was really on the agenda at that time. What I would say, and I suppose with Pond Street, what we have done is, which is also using concrete, which is presumably what the question's about. It's kind of highly optimized thickness of, I don't know if you remember the images, but it's like 150 slab, 150 walls, very, very thin actually. And it obviously uses a mix that, you know, high level of GGBS within it. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect that what we found with Lighthouse is, firstly, it is the finish. You don't add other materials. You don't plasterboard it. You don't paint it. It is the finish. So once you built it, that's it.
Yeah.
It works incredibly well in this country environmentally for the environment, the kind of physical, temperate environment of the house itself, in that it really works with the thermal flywheel that all these houses are designed to be naturally ventilated, opening windows at night, cooling the concrete, opening them to let the cool, you know, during the day emerge and keep the house cool. So they're a very important part of that, and that's much harder to do, or almost impossible to do with timber. And, you know, they also temper the light in a really interesting way. So there are lots of arguments, and I think we're working our way through them. And, you know, I think you can see some of our buildings are concrete, some of them are timber, depending on where they are and why. We get clients who say, I want that one, you know, I want timber, or I want concrete. And that's sometimes, you know, we did look on Pond Street at other options, but actually the client wanted it to be a concrete house. So with that in mind, we kind of work to optimize it as much as possible.
Good, thank you very much. I'll invite Jose to ask something. Jose, if you could please unmute yourself and
perfect.
Your camera on.
So Gianni, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the presentation, the projects. I mean, we are always encouraging people, students, to understand that architectural design, architectural design is a discipline that is about synthesis, integrating everything in a formal solution that we provide. I think there is something in your projects that shows like a very deep internal coherence, that maybe with a very clear strategy, with a gesture, everything seems solved. And puts together materiality, structure, space, light. And I think that's very powerful. I would like to ask you somehow two questions that are intertwined somehow, and people have been writing in the chat. So on one hand, you have explained us a bit your process, because you usually start with this analysis of the sunlight and so on. But maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the design process. And then Ray was also asking about this question of how important is these digital tools? Because maybe with intuition or with other approaches, we will probably come up with a similar idea, with similar form.
Don't think so.
Perfect.
I mean, I think that's a fundamental part of the way we work. So what we find is very important is to do all the analysis before you start designing. So if you come to the process of design, which includes intuition, obviously, having known what the issues are about the site, then I think you get a very different result. And you don't design something that then you have to kind of engineer a solution for. So all the digital tools we're using are really to work out what the problem is. And I specifically force myself not to think about what the project might become during that process. But clearly during that process, you start to gain a knowledge. You start to understand where the views are, where the wind's coming from, what the sun's doing, all these issues that you want to deal with in your design. And it becomes fundamental to the way you then will approach it when you do start I mean, we make lots and lots of models. There you can see models behind, but you know, lots of iterations of models. We start investigating something, we then make models of it, then we then might digitize those models and test them and see if they are dealing with the issues we've set ourselves. And that process, that kind of feedback loop continues all the way through. So, you know, there's a real mixture of, you know, model making, especially a bit like making in Studio in the Woods, is a really important part of understanding what the project might be about and how it might feel and what materials it could be made of and so on. But it's not just model making, it's not just digital. That's really important.
Thank you very much. I think I will invite Ray to come up with his views on this, because he also asked the question.
Okay.
Ray, if you are here, could you please unmute yourself?
Hi there.
Hi, Ray.
Interesting set of projects, and I particularly enjoyed the video work. They're very beautifully shot. It was just, aside from the analytical use of computation, when it comes to the manufacturing, I was just asking really about whether it's absolutely necessary to use computation in those contexts. You know, thinking of the likes of Tanya's Yoyogi gymnasium building in Tokyo and other ones like it, which have got incredibly complex hipped roof geometries that are, you know, doing all sorts of mental gymnastics actually. So it's just, you know, asking that question, you know, we
Yeah.
things are necessary, but are they really?
It's always very humbling when you look back, isn't it, at all those people who've done these incredible things in that way. I mean, I suppose I would say, for instance, in Garden House, one difference that was achievable, I think, through computation was that it's not symmetrical. There are two different angles of the roof, and the skylight itself is not in the kind of middle of those spaces. And that, in fact, led to an awful lot of the complexity that it ended up with. But at the same time, a lot of the character that's produced through that. So I'm not saying that wouldn't be possible without computers, but I think it was easier to resolve and be kind of understandable by manufacturers, those differences. I think you might then be forced, were you not doing that, to rationalize the form more. Sorry? Were you saying something? No.
I think you missed what you said there, David.
I think you froze a bit then, Gianni.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Where did I freeze?
It was probably, I think you managed to answer the question.
Okay, okay.
I always look at things like York Minster and wonder how they did it without a computer. You know, it is probably just harder. But
the rate to which you know, the old cathedral builders suffered many collapses during the buildings, and there's, you know, the history of these things going up is not accurately written, but there are collapses, and there's also much more repetition within that form. So I suppose it's just asking, you know, or talking about the precision with which we discuss the various tools that we have to hand, and, you know, the working between the manual model and the digital, I think, makes for a really interesting, more nuanced narrative than simply saying that, you know, we absolutely can't do these things without the computation. You know, I think we can get very, very hung up on some of that.
I mean, you know, the construction process has changed hugely, and you have to know exactly what you're building and have tested it and have engineered it, know what it's going to cost, know what it's going to be made of before you start building. So I suppose that does come into it as well.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And building up on this process of using the computer a lot, we were wondering as students, there was a student called Bruce, she asked about the coding language we would need to learn. And I was also wondering, do you think that we as architecture students should indeed learn how to code?
Well, it's much more straightforward for you now. And the tool we use in the office and in our teaching in Cardiff that I do with Kate is Grasshopper with Rhino. I mean, it's becoming very commonplace and being embedded, I think, even in Revit now. So, you know, it's not anywhere near as tortuous as it was. And I think you learn a lot by using it itself as a tool, just because you have to kind of create a logic of what you're trying to do. It's very different to drawing. You actually have to say, I want this to be spaced out equally, and I want it to change direction every time the sun does this or whatever. And then there are lots of plugins within that that you can use, like Ladybug and so on, that work with sunlight, that become incredibly important tools to use early on.
Yes, that is very true. Thank you. And on top of that, I was actually wondering whether the computational or the analog or making processes inform your designs the most. Which one of those? And why?
I think it depends on the project. Sometimes the computational process will unlock a really key aspect of something. I think especially one of those projects I showed at the end, the Sardinia project.
Yeah.
When you have a really complex topography and a kind of rule you're trying to achieve, we use Grasshopper to kind of resolve the arrangement of these rooms on this different topography, so that they didn't, there was no hierarchy that, or the hierarchy was that you could always see the sunset from every room.
Yeah.
And there are kind of lots of permutations of how that can work. And that really helped unlock it for us. I think we had a sense of what we were trying to achieve, but the computational process allowed us to achieve it.
Jose, you have a question, Jose? Okay.
No, it's just maybe, I mean, Colin has a few more, maybe one or two. I don't know, David, if you want to step in and comment anything.
I was just, I mean, you've talked a lot about computing. You've talked a lot about model making, but the other tool that we have is drawing. And I know that you draw very well. How do you feel about, I mean, you produce amazing technical drawings and very beautiful drawings. How do you feel about drawing, Gianni? Because that's our other area of these.
It's weird, I kind of draw less and less. And I keep thinking I should draw more and more. I find it's not three-dimensional enough. You're tending to draw plans and sections, and then the reality of those plans and sections is very different to what you think. So it's weird. I'm doing it less. I mean, drawings for information are a very different animal, but drawings in terms of the process of design, I think it's only really, let's say, when I'm talking to somebody in the studio and we're kind of sketching, why don't you make a model like this of this kind of thing? That's what I'm drawing, rather than, it kind of goes back to that. I don't want to have preconceived ideas about things, and I don't want the kind of blank piece of paper to become the building kind of instantly. It's so iterative, the process, that it almost gets in the way.
Thank you very much for the answer. And actually, I wanted to ask something for the panelists, as we are almost at the end of the presentation. I was wondering, for all the panelists, so David, Amy, and Matt there as well, how did Gianni's talk help or inform your teaching style, and maybe how would you integrate what you learned from him into our atelier?
No, I think it was great to see the presentation, and I think it was perfectly kind of pitched. And I think the discussion about particularly the digital and the making, and I think Gianni mentioned in the studio in the woods when he said about it's a process where he said that there isn't design, there was just the making. And I thought that was quite interesting, because actually what a question that I might put to Gianni actually is, do you think that in some of the digital processes, you can actually use that quite creatively? So it's a process that isn't necessarily designed, and it's not driven by any sort of optimization, but it's kind of open-ended, just like you would do with some material or something very much analog. I just wondered if you've got any comments on that in your process currently or historically.
Yeah, I mean, that can happen. It's kind of harder to, I suppose I like to know why something is the way it is. So I'm not, like, even in the non-design, we're calling it in Studio in the Woods. In a sense, it is designed in that we know what we're pursuing and what we're investigating. And it's very specific to that situation and what you're looking at. So we don't kind of play with the computer, I suppose, is maybe what you're asking. We don't do that because I wouldn't then know why it might be the way it is. And I like to know why. So yeah, we don't do that.
Who's going to answer this?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hello.
Yeah. So just to also answer your question, yeah, I found this your talk really interesting. From a perspective of the projects that we're doing at the moment, we've started with a barn that's been built by non-architects, and adapted and changed over time. And some of the kind of handmade details from your some of the projects that you were inspired by in the context of, say, Marrakesh and in the Costa Rica, kind of resonated with this idea of like lots of gaps and breaks and simple construction techniques. And I think in terms of how has that inspired or could inspire our projects is it's really pushed, well, it's inspired me to really think seriously about the potential for us to have a summer school where we test out building a facade panel or something using the kind of raw rough materials that are available in the barn and see what we can do with those. And I think also with the pavilion, the pavilion project, which is you call it pavilion project. I was very fascinated by the kind of construction models that the construction teams made, and also the models that you made for Costa Rica, which were kind of testing out the principles. And I think that really resonates with what we're interested in, which is having an idea, but then testing it and seeing how that kind of can be communicated, translated into practice. So there's lots of interesting aspects of your talk that really connected with what we're doing. So really appreciate you coming and talking to us.
Right. Pleasure.
Thank you very much for these answers, and also thank you very much, Gianni, for your talk. I will hand over to Jose to wrap it up, as it's already half past.
Well, David, I don't know if you want to do some closing remarks.
I just think it's what's great about what you've said, Gianni. I just like the analysis and that idea of not really acting instinctively and with preconceptions. That's what I think I really learned, and it's really great for our students to learn. I think, and the thoroughness of the work is what I really liked as well. And I know that everything is, well thought out from the day one, and then well thought out right the way through to the detail. And that I think is quite amazing. So I just like to say thanks for that. Otherwise, thanks for the great talk and for all the preparation and the work. Jose, do you want to wrap up?
Well, I think, I'm joining this comment right now. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Pleasure.
For
Thank
joining
you
us today. Thank you also making the Making Atelier to organize this talk. And maybe we can all turn the cameras on and join me with a big applause for Gianni. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So we will continue doing these talks, okay? You will receive soon more information about the coming ones, okay? So have a good evening, everyone. See you soon.